Yahoo.com. For many of us, this is one of the first websites we were ever allowed to visit on our parents' computer for the 15 minutes of AOL time we were allowed. And it's really crazy how far it's come in those years. It used to be kind of one of the main hubs for getting news in the early days of the internet, and now it's kind of devolved into almost like a clickbaity kind of blog spam type site. It's really a shame. This is the homepage here is akin to when you're at a grocery store and you see the magazines from like the Daily Mail or whatever sitting in the checkout aisle that are just flush with clickbait headlines and emotionally visceral content to get you to pick up that magazine. But overall, like, all my personal judgments aside, how can we make this UI better, right? Obviously, there's some things like removing this homepage huge full width ad and kind of de-emphasizing the ads a little bit and designing a content first approach. I understand why they're obviously doing this. Like, their main value driver is advertising revenue, but obviously if they disrespect the user too much, they're going to get less and less traffic and less eyeballs on those ads. So in addition to the ads, there's just a lot going on here. Lots of things are pulling for my attention. This background ad really doesn't help, but then there's this full hero section. There's very saturated colors off to the right. And then there's just lots of imagery pulling me around the page. As I scroll down, this is a little bit better, but at the end of the day, I'm really kind of hoping that I could see something a little simpler that kind of sends a signal to my brain that I should look at this first or something else and then something else. There's no like user flow baked into this site. So that's what we're going to go ahead and try to fix today. So as always, we've got our cheeky style guide here with, I tried to stay as close to the existing brand as I could. So I've taken all of their brand colors directly from their site. I was considering using their initial sans font, but I'm just going to use Fira Sans again. It's one of my favorite fonts, extremely performant, really flexible. And we're going to use that for headers and body and label text. So I've got the user stories as always. Like, what are we actually trying to do? What is Yahoo solving for people? And ultimately, it's really, well, from my perspective, it's to stay informed on current events, right? That's what it should be. It's a news site, right? But beyond that, I'm curious to see what articles are trending, what other topics are trending, kind of like how Twitter has their trending topics in the right-hand sidebar. I also want to see the current weather and view relevant, interesting advertisements when it makes sense to me. Again, big caveat there. And I think that all this considered kind of speaks to kind of a good place for your internet home. Here's all my news updates, here's the weather, here's interesting things that are trending around the world. And if it wasn't so ad-centric, I would maybe consider making it my homepage, or who even uses a homepage these days. But that's what we're going to get going on today, and I'm just going to get stuck in and see what we come up with. I think this is going to be a fun one to redesign, but I don't know, I might end up making the same mistakes. But I'll talk to you guys in about probably 2.5, maybe 3 hours. See you in a bit. One of the things that I think the existing Yahoo site got well was that search was featured prominently in their nav bar. Obviously, they know that Yahoo does lots of different things at this point in its life. So allowing people to quickly cut through all the noise and get to exactly what they're looking for is an important thing to feature in the header. So I'm including that here. Whenever you're dealing with a site that has a very complicated information architecture, meaning there's just lots of different types of data, there's lots of different categories and things like that, often the problems start with the site navigation, and the problem here in Yahoo is that they're mixing the categories of the potential articles with parts of their website. So in the existing navigation, the primary navigation, they had mail, news, finance, and Yahoo Plus. Whereas what we should really be doing in the primary navigation is helping the user select which part of the site they want to browse, and then in a secondary navigation, allow them to dig in a little further. For example, I want to look at the news. Okay, great. What category do you want to browse after that? Just makes more sense semantically. Whenever you have a list of categories in a secondary navigation like this, it's always a difficult design problem to select the default, because we don't want to force an opinion or a bias on the user by selecting, say, the Ukraine war is the default, right? Instead, we just have a category called trending or popular that shows all of the articles that are getting lots of concurrent viewers. And then that way we solve the problem of having a sensible default without biasing the user. As you're watching me build this here, I want to stress that it's very important that you notice why I chose to make the font in this first featured article as big as I'm making it here. One of the main problems with the Yahoo news site, or really any sort of news site these days, is that there's no clear path for my attention to move down the page. And one way we can solve that is by demanding the attention of the user. And you do that through big, bold text. Unfortunately, if you do demand the user's attention, you have to be careful and not demand it elsewhere, because once you demand it in more than one place, users suddenly become confused again. So you demand the attention in one place with big bold text or some really saturated color, and then from there, use the visual hierarchy to move them farther through the page or through the flow if you're designing a SaaS product. Here's another good example of how to use visual hierarchy and how I'm actually using it incorrectly in this design. You'll see I'm adding this trending box over in the right-hand sidebar, but at first I decide to put a gray background on it with an inset inner shadow. I'm realizing now, well, maybe shortly after this, that it pulls way too much visual attention, and we really don't want users focusing on the right-hand sidebar. We want them focusing on that the featured article. So just subdue it a little bit and imply that it's secondary with some nice appropriate label text and the shorter container box. Those of you with a very strong sense for typography design are probably feeling a little weird right now and thinking that these titles on the right are a little too small. And I don't realize this until the very end of the design when I look at everything in context, but the titles are just too small because they're also titles, but the only other title visible right now is huge, so the contrast is way too significant. It's closer to body text than it is to header text. So I eventually do realize, and perhaps some of you realize watching this now, that this text needs to be made a little bigger. And it's just interesting how these kinds of design intuitions have really practical implications for the visual hierarchy of the page. and really trying to hammer home the importance of visual hierarchy in this episode today, but clearly these other articles below the featured articles have incorrect article title heights. As you can see, the text is the same height and weight as the featured article, implying that they're also featured, but they're not featured, so these titles are incorrectly sized and they should be slightly smaller. And I think one of the fundamental problems with these modern news sites is that they rely way too heavily on third-party advertisers to fund the bottom line. So having some kind of a premium experience makes sense, and what better way to advertise that experience than a gated set of articles that are clearly valuable but locked behind a paywall. That way you're sharing 90% of your value with users for free, but if you want to opt in to view some of the more specially treated articles that you've spent way more time on, they have to pay a little bit every month, which I think is totally reasonable. And then, of course, sometimes users might just be interested in the weather for the day. You know, it's kind of an interesting piece of information they can get if they go to Yahoo for their news and it's the first site they're visiting that day. However, there's really no need to show them the whole week. In fact, the most interesting information and most relevant information is what's the temperature like outside and is it raining or not? Like, is there some special weather condition I need to be aware of? And if the user wants to learn more about the weather, they can click on that widget to get a more detailed synopsis of what's going on. But there's no need to overwhelm them with the details of the week unless they've opted in for it. There we go. I think we've successfully saved Yahoo from themselves. At this point, we have a UI that does a lot of different things like the current Yahoo site does, but it does them in a manner that it doesn't totally overwhelm the user. There's a very clear path that we're defining for the user to continue browsing through the site without hitting them with lots of different call to actions at once. And we're still able to sneak a cheeky little advertisement in there. So overall, I think this would really solve the user problem much better than the current iteration and would naturally result in more revenue for Yahoo. But hey, that's just me, a lowly designer who thinks that design is the solution to every problem. But here, of course, we have the old layout, just very confusing, lots of colors, lots of competing call to actions, really difficult for me to figure out what I'm supposed to look at here. And then, of course, we have the new layout that does, like I said, essentially all of that same stuff, but without the clutter, right? It's something about it just feels so much more usable and readable than the existing UI. So that's it for me, folks. Hopefully you liked this one. Quite a complicated layout to redesign, and I had to use a lot of different patterns that I'm not 100% used to. So this was a good learning experience for me as well. If you think there's a better way to redesign it, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And as always, if you think of a UI that's just totally crap that you want to see featured next week, pop it in the comments and we'll see what we can do. But until then, have a lovely weekend and I'll see you next Tuesday.